We've grown accustomed to seeing Norse gods in gleaming armor on modern movie screens. They swing magical hammers, wear red cloaks, and heroically save the universe from invaders. Hollywood has turned the harsh mythology of the northern peoples into a colorful and safe attraction for the whole family. But the real religion of the 8th century Vikings was completely different and far more terrifying. It was an incredibly brutal, pragmatic, and highly practical system of physical survival. In the extreme conditions of Scandinavia, people did not pray for spiritual enlightenment or world peace. They asked for the physical strength to survive the cold, luck on a bloody raid, and a little warm sunshine. The Viking gods were not benevolent heavenly fathers who sincerely loved their earthly children. They were ruthless mafia bosses with whom one had to conduct very tough and dangerous negotiations. A modern, educated person would surely be horrified by the customs of an ordinary Scandinavian settlement in that incredible era. But it was precisely this harsh reality that drove them to build the finest warships in the world. They successfully sailed to America 500 years before Columbus learned to read maps. Their brutal religion did not hinder technological progress. On the contrary, it forced them to constantly move forward. To stop meant to die, and the harsh gods constantly reminded them of this golden rule. Today, we will permanently strip away the glossy Hollywood veneer from the myths of ancient and mysterious Scandinavia. We will delve deeply into the brutal, yet incredibly logical world of the real Norse pagans and seafarers. You will see deities who resemble criminal cartel leaders more than righteous saints. And the most striking thing is that this harsh system actually helped people prevail for centuries. Welcome to the true Viking Age, where there is absolutely no place for modern weaklings and cowards. Most modern people sincerely believe Odin to be the kind grandfather of the vast Norse pantheon. The film industry has carefully painted a picture of a wise king who cares for his subjects like a father. But the real Vikings of the 8th century would never have called the great all-father kind or safe. In reality, Odin was the god of madness, ecstasy, dark sorcery, and extremely brutal warfare. He resembled not a wise president, but a cunning boss of an ancient criminal syndicate. During the era of active Scandinavian expansion, ordinary farmers tried not to attract Odin's attention at all. If you wanted a good harvest or healthy cows, you turned to entirely different deities. Only kings, ambitious warlords, and mad berserkers prayed desperately to Odin before a deadly battle. He was an elite god exclusively for those who were playing for the highest stakes in life. And his divine help always came at an incredibly and terrifyingly high price for the naive supplicant. Odin was historically notorious for cold-bloodedly betraying his favorites at the most inopportune moment. Sounds like a completely terrible strategy for attracting new followers, doesn't it? But behind this lay the incredibly profound philosophical and practical logic of the ancient Scandinavian tribes. They sincerely believed that the god needed the best warriors for the final battle at the very end of time. Therefore, he mercilessly took the most talented fighters in the prime of their physical strength. To attain supreme wisdom, this stern god voluntarily sacrificed himself. He personally pierced himself with a spear and hung on the giant world tree for 9 long days, without warm food, without water, bleeding out in the biting cold of the northern wind. Modern self-help coaches constantly urge you to simply step out of your cozy comfort zone. One man literally went beyond the very limits of life itself to uncover the mystical secrets of the ancient runes. This terrifying act perfectly illustrates the true value of knowledge in the harsh world of ancient Scandinavia. Wisdom was worth far more than gold, ringing silver, or even any human life. One man calmly sacrificed his own eye simply to drink from the magical fountain of wisdom. Many modern people are not willing to read a Lati just to gain new, useful knowledge. An ancient god was willing to voluntarily become disabled just to understand the basic structure of the universe. The Almighty's appearance also differed greatly from Hollywood's glossy standards of beauty. He most often wandered the frozen earth in the guise of a dirty old man in a tattered gray cloak. The god secretly tested people's hospitality, cruelly punishing the greedy and generously rewarding kind hosts. In those harsh times, hospitality was the most important law of survival in a frigid climate. If you closed the door on a traveler in winter, you effectively became a cold-blooded murderer. And here begins the darkest historical distinction between a beautiful myth and a cruel reality. Sacrifices to Odin were always performed through ritual, hanging from trees and piercing with a sharp spear. The Roman legions crucified criminals, while the Vikings hanged innocent people to win the favor of their chief god. In the sacred pagan grove of Uppsala, dozens of human and animal bodies dangled from the branches of ancient trees. My hair literally stands on end at the mere thought of this blood-curdling spectacle. Why did society need such demonstrative and incredibly terrifying religious cruelty? Amid constant bloody tribal warfare, the tribe required the unquestionable authority of a strong military leader. The primal fear of Odin legitimized the power of kings who officially considered themselves his direct descendants. It was a brilliant, ancient political strategy, working 100 times better than any modern propaganda. The cruel god of the heavens automatically justified absolutely any cruel actions by earthly rulers. Odin was also considered the patron of the berserkers, the most fearsome and unpredictable warriors of that harsh era. These men would enter a deep battle trance and fight without chainmail, biting their wooden shields. Modern clinical psychiatry would call this condition severe psychosis or mass war hysteria, but the Vikings sincerely believed it was a divine gift that Odin personally sent to his chosen children. In close combat, such a frenzied man was truly worth a dozen ordinary and perfectly healthy soldiers. So, the chief god of the North was a traitor, a powerful sorcerer, and a great lover of gallows. He never promised you a peaceful life, social justice, or forgiveness for past sins. He guaranteed only secret knowledge, battle fury, and the chance to die with a heavy sword in hand. For people whose lives consisted entirely of war and survival, he was the ideal charismatic leader, and they followed him into battle with a joy that modern religious fanatics would envy. Forget the polished heartthrob from the movies who elegantly swings his shiny magic hammer. The real Norse Thor looked like a huge, scruffy, red-bearded man with a wild, animalistic appetite. His eyes were red with rage, his manners were coarse, and he had a tendency towards sudden, everyday violence. He was not a refined aristocrat of the pantheon, but rather the chief bouncer of the local divine bar. This guy always solved problems not with long diplomatic speeches, but with a precise blow to the skull. In stark contrast to the cunning and aristocratic Odin, Thor was an absolute favorite of the people. It was his protective amulets in the shape of a hammer that 90% of ordinary Viking laborers wore. Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and weary sailors considered him their best friend and heavenly protector. Thor was the most straightforward, simple, and predictable god for the entire Scandinavian working class. He too worked very hard, ate endlessly, and sincerely hated all kinds of cunning intellectual tricks. Thor's legendary hammer, Mjolnir, in reality symbolized far more than just destructive combat power. It was a traditional blacksmith's tool that created useful objects from hard, unyielding metal. This heavy hammer was used to solemnly bless new marriages, the birth of children, and even funeral pyres. Sounds rather strange for a weapon of mass destruction against ice giants, doesn't it? But for the wise ancient Scandinavians, creation and destruction were simply two sides of the same coin. Thor regularly traveled across the sky in a chariot pulled by two huge, noisy goats. This seems incredibly funny compared to the graceful horses or dragons of modern fantasy, but hidden within this myth is a brilliant practical insight into the harsh peasant life of the frigid north. Goats could easily survive in the mountains, feeding on sparse grass, unlike the very demanding horses. Every night, Thor would slaughter them for a hearty dinner, and early in the morning, they would miraculously come back to life. This strange myth served as an ancient psychological guarantee of food security for very poor people. Modern, brightly lit supermarkets easily solve the problem of hunger, exclusively at your own expense. Thor, however, demonstrated that meat could be endless if one took care not to break the animal's bones. It was a unique ecological lesson in treating valuable food resources with incredible care. Ancient people understood perfectly well that thoughtless wastefulness would very quickly lead them to starvation. Interestingly, Thor's sworn enemies, the Jötnar or giants, directly personified the forces of wild nature. Giant glaciers, hurricanes, sudden rockfalls, and storms. These were the things the god actually fought against. The Vikings lived in a constant and exhausting struggle against the unbearably harsh Scandinavian climate. Every successful strike of Thor's hammer was a symbolic victory of civilization over primal, natural chaos. Today, we build concrete dams, but back then, people simply asked Thor to smash yet another approaching glacier. Once, Thor accidentally lost his hammer, and the insolent giants demanded the beautiful goddess Freya in exchange. What does a stern and brutal god of war do in such a humiliating and hopeless situation? He calmly changes into a woman's wedding dress and sets off to face his enemies disguised as a flustered bride. Just imagine a modern, tough special forces fighter in lace lingerie on a secret combat mission. The Vikings simply adored this funny story because it showed their hero's ultimate pragmatism. To achieve a vital victory, any means available is acceptable, even if they look downright ridiculous. Personal pride means nothing when the survival of your entire world is at stake. This is an excellent and very telling example of how people in the 8th century thought. They had absolutely no complicated hang-ups about chivalric honor or ostentatious nobility. If you won the battle, you were absolutely right, and no one would respect the dead losers. Thor loyally defended Midgard, the world of ordinary people, like the most reliable, heavily armed border guard. In a modern regular army, he would certainly have been a tank battalion commander on the very front lines. He never engaged in secret intrigues, never lied to your face, and always struck straight on. Such honest straightforwardness made him the ideal folk hero for simple, open-hearted people. You always knew exactly what to expect from Thor. Unlike the incredibly cunning and dangerous Odin, that is precisely why, during the forced Christianization of Scandinavia, the cult of the simple Thor endured longer than any other. People categorically refused to take off their iron hammers, often stubbornly wearing them alongside their crosses. The Christian church had to make enormous efforts to erase this red-haired giant from the people's memory. But he remains forever in the English name of the day of the week, Thursday, Thor's sacred day. This hard-working guy with calluses on his hands proved more resilient than any global historical upheaval. The ancient word Valhalla itself is associated today with the highest reward, eternal rest, and endless pleasures. Popular culture actively sells us this image as an elite, exclusive club for chosen superheroes. But the real mythical Hall of Odin was infinitely far from the concept of a cozy garden of paradise. In reality, it was a gigantic training camp with an incredibly strict military regime. And you didn't end up there for rest at all, but for eternal and exhausting military service. Let's take a closer look at a typical day for a fallen Norse hero visiting the great Odin. You wake up early in the morning, put on heavy steel armor, and head out to the large training field. Then, for hours on end, you hack away at your best friends with swords until you yourself are brutally killed. By evening, your fatal wounds have healed, you are resurrected, and you head to the hall to drink strong beer. Modern trainers would call this extreme athletic overtraining with not a single day off, and this bloody cycle takes place every single day, right up until the very tragic end of the world. Why on earth did Odin need such an exhausting and brutal training regimen for dead people? Because he was obsessively preparing for Ragnarök, the final and decisive battle against the forces of absolute chaos. He had absolutely no use for laid-back spirits peacefully sipping cocktails on soft white clouds. He needed a perfect army of obedient Terminators, knowing neither fear, pain, nor fatigue. Not every brave and strong person of the Viking age could make it to the legendary Valhalla. You absolutely had to die with heavy weapons in your hands right on the battlefield. If you lived peacefully into old age and died in a warm bed, Valhalla was definitely not in your future. Such peaceful people were sent to Helheim, an incredibly gloomy, boring, and cold realm of the ordinary dead. This created an incredible social incentive for the elderly to seek a quick death in bloody battle. Imagine a society where a well-deserved retirement means eternal shame and endless suffering. That is precisely why elderly Vikings often deliberately provoked fights or set out on utterly hopeless raids. They literally begged their enemies with tears in their eyes to kill them so they could get the right ticket to heaven. It's simply a brilliant system of brutal social engineering for an aggressive, warlike state. No one wanted to support the elderly for free, and the elderly themselves sought to leave this life as gloriously as possible. In Valhalla, every evening they served the meat of the enormous magical boar, Saehrimnir, which was boiled daily. It sounds quite appetizing, but try eating the same boiled meat for an eternity. The only drinks available were beer or sweet mead, flowing endlessly from the udder of a magical goat. Modern nutritionists would instantly faint at the sight of such a specific daily menu. But for the perpetually hungry peasant of the 9th century, it seemed like a true and unsurpassed culinary miracle. Interestingly, brave female warriors, or the famous shield maidens, could also enter Odin's halls. Archaeologists are increasingly finding richly furnished female graves containing full and heavy military gear. The Valkyries, who gathered the souls of the bravely fallen, were by no means delicate angels with white wings. They were true demons of the battlefield, coldly deciding who would live today and who would drown in blood. An encounter with a Valkyrie always meant that today was your worst, yet most glorious day in life. According to myth, Valhalla had exactly 540 doors, through each of which 800 warriors could pass. Mathematically, this means that Odin's personal army numbered exactly 432,000 immortal and perfect warriors. To the ancient Scandinavians, whose forest settlements rarely exceeded a few hundred people, this number seemed infinite. It was the unimaginable scale of a gigantic empire they could not even begin to fathom. scale, and yet they all trained relentlessly for a battle they were destined to lose once and for all. And this is the most striking and profound fact about Valhalla and the harsh Viking religion as a whole. All that bloody training, unbearable pain, and endless boiled meat were for a war that was lost from the start. One knew perfectly well that during Ragnarök, he and his invincible army would be completely annihilated. They had prepared for millennia to march out into the open field and die heroically, once and for all. What modern ideology could compel people to work so hard for a defeat that is absolutely guaranteed? This paradoxical concept perfectly reveals the true character of the northern peoples of that difficult time. What mattered to them was not the final victory, but how one faced one's inevitable doom. Military duty, personal honor, and courage were valued far higher than the final, successful outcome. Valhalla was not a place of rest, but an elite school of supreme and uncompromising existential dignity. This was a brutal philosophy, reserved exclusively for those who fully understood the transience of all human existence. Modern pop culture has turned Loki into a typical and easily understood supervillain with funny horns on his helmet. He is constantly hatching petty schemes, desperately wants to seize power, and endlessly argues with the mighty Thor. But the real Norse Loki was a far more complex, profound, and contradictory mythological figure. He was not pure evil, because the Vikings did not think in such black and white terms at all. Loki was more like Asgard's chief crisis manager, who himself constantly created these deadly crises. In ancient myths, Loki constantly puts all the gods in unbearably complex and deadly situations, and then, miraculously, he finds an incredibly ingenious solution to save everyone from certain doom. It was he who gave Odin his spear, Gungnir, and Thor his mighty, destructive hammer Mjolnir. It sounds absolutely crazy that the gods' main weapons were obtained thanks to the dirty intrigues of a local prankster. But such was the ironclad logic of the North. Something incredibly useful is always born out of utter chaos. Loki was Odin's official brother-in-arms, and an unbreakable ancient blood oath bound them together. Without this sacred oath, the other gods would have torn the cunning god to pieces long ago for his incredibly cruel pranks. Modern giant corporations often have such toxic, yet incredibly productive and intelligent employees. Absolutely everyone hates them, but no one can fire them because they bring in huge profits. Loki was precisely such an irreplaceable generator of innovation in the stagnant and conservative divine world. To obtain the artifacts he needed, Loki never shied away from any method, no matter how shameful or humiliating. Once, he transformed into a beautiful mare and seduced a giant's horse to save the walls of Asgard. As a result of this very strange union, he personally sired an 8-legged stallion named Sleipnir. This magical horse became Odin's personal mount, the fastest creature in all 9 worlds. Can you imagine a modern, proud villain willing to endure such public humiliation to achieve his goal? To the intelligent Vikings, Loki symbolized the constant changeability of life and the terrifying unpredictability of blind fate. They knew full well that the sea could be calm in the morning and easily kill you that very evening. Loki was the very embodiment of this shifting wind, wildfire, and elemental natural destruction. Without him, the gods' perfect world would quickly turn into a boring, static, and utterly lifeless swamp. Controlled chaos is simply essential for evolution, and the ancient Scandinavians understood this perfectly and clearly. And in the end, Loki's cruel pranks went too far when he cunningly killed the radiant Balder. Balder was the kindest god, the universal love and hope of the entire Norse pantheon. For this terrible crime, the gods captured Loki and bound him tightly to a rock with the intestines of his own son. A huge, poisonous snake was hung above his face, its burning venom constantly dripping directly into his eyes. This was an unbearably harsh punishment for violating the cardinal rule. One must never destroy the very foundations of society. Loki's faithful wife, Sigrun, voluntarily stayed with him and constantly held a bowl to catch the falling venom. But when the bowl overflowed, she had to step away for a second to pour the toxic liquid onto the ground. At that moment, the acid poison would fall on Loki's face, and he would scream in unbearable agony. The Vikings sincerely believed that his violent convulsions caused what we today call earthquakes. This is an excellent and poetic example of how mythology skillfully explained the real geological catastrophes of antiquity. Loki is destined to be finally freed only just before the end of the world, during the great Ragnarök. He will confidently lead a vast army of the dead from Helheim on ships made from the fingernails of the dead. This terrifying fleet will attack the gods, and Loki will kill the defender of mankind, the fair Heimdall, in a fierce battle. But in this epic battle, they will both perish, destroying each other forever in a deadly duel. Chaos will inevitably devour itself, finally clearing the way for a completely new and bright world. Loki's tragic story taught the stern Scandinavians one very important and practical life lesson. A cunning, resourceful mind and a sharp tongue are very useful, but they can never replace loyalty and honor. Loki was the wisest of the gods, but in the end, he remained forever chained to a cold rock. The Vikings highly valued quick wits, but sincerely despised those who broke their oaths and betrayed their friends. No society could survive if you couldn't trust the person next to you in a tight battle formation. Today, modern psychologists would undoubtedly describe Loki as the classic ancient archetype of the cunning trickster. He skillfully breaks into the system to reveal its hidden vulnerabilities and force it to renew itself. In the world of modern technology, he is a genius hacker who finds critical holes in your supposedly perfect security. Norse religion was so wise that it built this useful virus right into the core of its system. Without Loki, the story of the fearsome Vikings would be empty, incredibly predictable, and utterly uninteresting. Most people naively think of Freya as the local Nordic counterpart to the ancient Greek goddess Aphrodite. They vividly imagine a benevolent goddess of love, ethereal beauty, romance, and spring blossoms. But in the incredibly brutal world of the Vikings, love always went hand in hand with a great deal of bloodshed. Freya was indeed the goddess of passion, but she also rightfully ruled over war, magic, and death. She didn't just send air kisses, she personally reaped the souls of the most brutal and skilled warriors. Freya's appearance and magical attributes are full of contradictions that literally blow the modern mind. She rode proudly in a chariot drawn by two enormous, fluffy, and wild forest cats. It sounds incredibly cute, until you remember that Scandinavian lynxes could easily tear a person in half. She had a magical cloak made of falcon feathers, allowing her to fly between worlds at tremendous speed. She was a fearsome and powerful entity whom even great heroes feared to turn their backs on. Few modern people know this, but Freya had the legal right of first choice among fallen warriors. Only half of the slain heroes went to Odin in his famous Valhalla for endless training. The other half of the most elite fighters went to Folkvanger, the personal hall of the beautiful and dangerous Freya. Why did the goddess of love even need a massive personal army of dead professional assassins? Because she, too, was diligently preparing to defend her home during the final battle of Ragnarök. Freya generously taught the gods and humans cedar, an ancient and very dark magic of divination. This magic was historically considered incredibly powerful, but utterly shameful for true, rugged men. Odin was often and openly mocked by the other gods for secretly practicing these feminine spells. But for the wise Freya, magic was an entirely natural tool for wielding power over minds and hearts. With the help of satyr, one could easily alter destinies, inflict diseases, and win entire wars. Love, as understood by the Scandinavians, rarely resembled the sweet plot of a modern romantic comedy. Freya often and pragmatically used her unearthly beauty as a bargaining chip to obtain artifacts. For the sake of the famous golden necklace Brisingamen, she willingly spent one night each with 4 dwarf blacksmiths. Modern, strict morality would quickly condemn the goddess for such behavior for selfish personal gain. But the Vikings deeply respected her ability to take everything she needed from life by any means available. In those harsh times, marriage was considered an economic union, not a romantic union of two loving hearts. Freya presided over the wild passion that suddenly arose outside these rigid social frameworks. She was the goddess of those destructive emotions that burned entire villages to the ground and sparked blood feuds. Such love was an unpredictable force of nature, much like a sudden storm on the open, cold sea. It could instantly inspire a great feat, or it could rob a person of their sanity forever. The Vikings frequently and en masse sacrificed pigs to Freya during important religious festivals. The massive boar was her sacred animal, symbolizing unbridled fertility and wild battle fury. The hot blood of the sacrifice was splashed onto the altars so that the goddess would grant a bountiful harvest in the cold autumn. This stands in stark and frightening contrast to the delicate offerings of wildflowers in other ancient cultures. The northern goddess of love always demanded hot red blood on the cold white snow. Freya's enigmatic husband, the god Od, would constantly disappear on unknown and very long journeys. The goddess searched for him desperately all over the world, weeping tears that instantly turned into pure gold. In salt water, these same tears became precious northern amber, which was so highly prized by merchants. This incredibly beautiful myth explained to people the origin of valuable resources on their very barren land. The goddess's personal pain was literally converted into hard currency for the survival of ordinary people. Freya was a shining example of female independence in the harsh patriarchal society of the ancient Scandinavians. Women in the rugged Viking era had legal rights to divorce, own land, and manage the household. They proudly held the keys to their homes and could easily throw an unwelcome husband out the door. The goddess perfectly reflected this social status, being a strong, independent, and very dangerous figure. She never blindly obeyed Odin and always played her own cunning game. Today, the image of Freya reminds us that ancient religions were by no means primitive fairy tales. Her complex image fused sex, death, wealth, and independence into a single, indestructible monolith. She persistently taught the women of the North to defend their interests through cunning, magic, and strength. She is not just a sweet and kind girl with kittens, but a true queen of a cruel world. And she never forgave those fools who tried to infringe upon her lawful rights. In modern religions, communication with higher powers most often boils down to quiet prayer or meditation. People simply ask for good health, happiness, and money, offering nothing to the deity in return. The Vikings considered such a naive, one-sided approach to the gods to be sheer audacity and incredible stupidity. Their harsh religion was based on the principle of a business exchange where every miracle had to be paid for. It was a direct and harsh contract, always sealed with the hot blood of animals or humans. The traditional ritual of sacrifice was called a blot and was the most important social event of the entire year. The entire community would gather. The local elder would slaughter an animal and collect its fresh blood in a bowl. Then, using special green twigs, this blood was sprinkled on statues of the gods, the temple walls, and the people themselves. It sounds like a gruesome scene from a horror movie, one that would make the blood run cold in modern veins. But for them, it was the equivalent of modern communion, uniting the community into a single, powerful whole. The delicious meat of the sacrificial animals was never thrown away or burned on bonfires in vain. It was simmered for a long time in huge cauldrons and eaten with relish at a grand feast for the entire village. The gods received only symbolic blood, the invisible soul of the animal, and the steam from the hot food. Ancient people were too poor to throw good horse meat or fatty pork into the fire. This was an incredibly practical approach to divine taxes, one that any farmer would wholeheartedly approve of. Human sacrifices did indeed exist, though they were not an everyday practice among ordinary Vikings. They were performed only in times of the deepest crises, terrible epidemics, severe famine, or before a great war. When the usual currency of livestock no longer worked, they had to pay with the lives of living people. Most often, slaves or dangerous enemies taken captive were sacrificed. But sometimes, society demanded the life of the chieftain himself, or even the king, for the sake of saving everyone else. In the 9th century, Sweden had a king named Domaldi, during whose reign a terrible, long-lasting famine began. In the first difficult year, the people sacrificed bulls, but the harvest still failed. In the second year, they cold-bloodedly killed people, but the frozen ground still yielded nothing. In the third year, the Council of Elders decided that the unlucky and weak ruler himself was to blame for everything. They killed the king, lavishly sprinkled the altars with his blood, and the harvest finally turned out wonderfully. This instructive story illustrates the incredible level of responsibility a leader bore in Scandinavian society. Today, cunning politicians can ruin the economy for years and retire to a very comfortable life. The king of the fierce Vikings, however, was responsible for the prosperity of his people with his very neck and blood. If the gods turned away from a leader, it meant his divine favor had completely run out. And in the harsh northern climate, tolerating failures was deadly dangerous for everyone's survival. The Scandinavians had almost no stone temples as we understand them today, with the exception of the famous Uppsala. Most often, large-scale blot ceremonies were held outdoors, in sacred groves or near sacred stones. The wild outdoors was the best temple for people who made their living from the sea and the land. They clearly sensed the presence of higher powers in the rumble of thunder and the rustle of oak leaves. Why build tall stone walls when the entire vast world is already a grand edifice of the gods? During bloody rituals, they always drank sacred mead in a strictly defined and ancient order. The first large cup was raised to Odin for guaranteed victory in future military campaigns. The second horn was drunk to Freyr and Njörður, asking for a good harvest and calm seas for the ships. Then they would always commemorate the departed ancestors who were invisibly present at every important community festival. This strict protocol fostered the iron discipline necessary for survival in the harsh conditions of the early Middle Ages. Interestingly, the role of respected priests was often filled by local chieftains or heads of large families. The Vikings had absolutely no separate caste of priests who would dictate the will of the heavens. Every free man with a weapon had the full right to communicate with the gods directly, without intermediaries. This made society surprisingly democratic compared to the rigid hierarchy of Christian Europe at the time. God was your formidable business partner, not an unreachable lord on a golden throne. These bloody and boisterous rituals shocked Christian missionaries who were trying to Christianize the northern lands. They described the Vikings in horror as savages bathing in blood and worshipping terrible demons. But behind this ostentatious cruelty lay a deep and mystical connection between man and the harsh natural world. Sacrifices constantly reminded the Vikings that all life demands a constant price, and this brutal ancient truth remains relevant even today in our safe digital age. Many modern films depict Vikings rushing into battle wearing fur capes over their bare bodies. This cinematic image of a savage barbarian has nothing to do with historical and military reality. A real 8th century Scandinavian warrior was equipped with incredible practicality and engineering ingenuity. They did not rely solely on the protection of their gods, preferring to trust in high-quality steel and thick leather. God helps only those who put on good chainmail themselves before the start of a bloody battle. Weaponsmithing in those days was considered not merely a craft, but a true sacred art. Blacksmiths were held in the highest regard, and their work was valued above that of many skalds. Forging a single fine sword required months of grueling labor at the red-hot forge. This process was often accompanied by special rituals dedicated to Thor and the underground gnome craftsmen. A well-balanced sword was worth as much as an entire farmstead with cows and slaves. The famous Scandinavian axes were also masterpieces of utilitarian military design. They were light enough for quick strikes, yet possessed incredible penetrating power against shields. Modern axes for chopping wood bear no resemblance to the elegant Viking battle weapons. Their shape allowed not only for chopping, but also for hooking the enemy's shield, exposing it to a strike. It was clever geometry of death, developed by generations of people who were constantly killing one another. The Vikings' round wooden shield was not merely passive protection, but an active and formidable weapon. At the center of the shield was an iron umbo, which could be used to smash the face of a distracted enemy. The shield itself was made of lightweight wood so that the warrior's arm wouldn't tire during a long battle. If the shield broke, it wasn't considered a tragedy, since its main purpose was to absorb the blow of an axe. Modern composite body armor works on exactly the same principle of single-use destruction. Interestingly, helmets with horns are a complete and absurd invention of 19th century theater artists. No sane warrior would put a structure on his head that an enemy's sword could catch on. Historical Viking helmets were smooth, streamlined, and often featured an iron half mask to protect the face. This mask gave the warrior a faceless, terrifying appearance, stripping him of human emotion in the eyes of the enemy. Encountering such a faceless iron demon in the fog was more terrifying than any Hollywood horror movie. Chainmail was an incredibly expensive luxury, available only to chieftains and the most successful warriors. It consisted of thousands of interwoven iron rings, each of which had to be riveted by hand. Can you imagine how long it took to make a single metal shirt like that? Most ordinary Vikings wore thick leather jackets, impregnated with wax for extra durability. But even such simple protection could save a life from a glancing blow from a sharp blade. The ancient Scandinavians' attitude toward their personal weapons deserves special mention. Swords were given poetic names: Widowmaker, Snakebite, or Odin's Flame. Weapons were passed down from father to son as the greatest heirloom and a symbol of the clan's strength. If the line ended, the sword was sometimes deliberately broken and placed in the grave alongside its last owner. The weapon had a soul of its own, and without a master, it was meant to die. Before battle, warriors carefully inspected their equipment, trusting neither blind luck nor divine miracles. One might send you battle fury, but he certainly wouldn't sharpen your dulled axe. The Vikings' pragmatism was evident in the fact that religion never replaced common sense for them. You can pray to Frey for victory, but you must hold your shield steady and firm. This is the perfect balance between faith in higher powers and personal responsibility for your own life. Even the famous Viking ships were essentially massive systems of complex weaponry. Drakers could run aground in shallow water, allowing troops to land directly on the enemy's sandy beach. They were the equivalent of modern special forces landing craft, only made of oak and resin. The engineering mindset of the Norse was always geared toward maximizing the effectiveness of aggression and survival. Technology always went hand in hand with their cruel and demanding gods. Ultimately, the material culture of the Vikings demonstrates their incredible level of practical development. They were not unwashed savages. They were professional and well-equipped killers. Their religion demanded strength from them, and their blacksmiths provided them with the tools to wield that strength. In this brutal world, victory went not to those who prayed the loudest, but to those who forged steel the best. And the gods of Asgard smiled sincerely upon precisely such pragmatic and well-armed people. No other ancient religion has such a detailed and grim description of the end of the world. The concept of Ragnarök is the greatest masterpiece of Norse mythology, striking in its fatalism. The gods know their future. They know they will lose, yet they still prepare for battle every day. This is an incredibly powerful psychological lesson for people living in constant struggle with nature. The inevitability of death does not relieve you of the duty to fight until the very last second. Ragnarök does not begin with fire and explosions, but with a 3-year-long terrible winter called Fimbulwinter. The sun hides behind the clouds, the earth is bound by eternal ice, and people begin killing one another for food. For the people of Scandinavia, a prolonged winter was not an abstract fairy tale, but a very real and frequent threat. The myth describes an ecological catastrophe in which nature finally ceases to sustain human life. This bears a frightening resemblance to modern scientific scenarios of a nuclear winter or global climate change. At this moment, all moral and social laws of human society collapse. Brothers begin to kill brothers for a piece of bread, and sons take up arms against their fathers. Loki breaks free from his bonds, and the giant wolf Fenrir tears apart the magical chains. Everything that the gods have held back for centuries through order and law bursts forth. This is a vivid demonstration of just how fragile any civilization is in the face of primal chaos. The gods do not flee from danger or try to hide in their golden halls. The guardian Heimdall blows his horn, summoning an army of dead heroes from the vast Valhalla. They line up in battle formation, fully aware that most of them will not return. Modern people often give up when faced with an unsolvable or difficult problem. The Vikings taught that dignity lies in the very act of resistance, not in the guarantee of victory. In the final battle, all the major gods face their personal and most terrifying nightmares. One engages in a hopeless battle with the giant wolf Fenrir and is swallowed by him. Thor finally slays the world serpent, but manages to take only 9 steps before dying from its venom. Even their victories prove to be Pyrrhic, bringing no salvation to the divine pantheon itself. This is a stark reminder that every great power always has its limits. The world itself is engulfed in a gigantic fire as the fiery giant Surtur burns absolutely everything that lives. Stars fall from the black sky, and the charred earth slowly sinks into the boiling ocean. Cinema loves to show happy endings where heroes miraculously save the planet at the last second. Norse religion tells you honestly, one day, everything will come to an end, and there is nothing you can do to change it. It is a harsh but incredibly honest cure for false illusions and childish hopes. But this is precisely where the deepest and brightest idea of all Norse mythology lies. After the fire dies down and the ocean calms, a new, green land will rise from the water. A few surviving lesser gods will find the golden chess pieces of their great fathers in the grass. 2 surviving humans, Liv and Liv Trasir, will emerge from hiding to give birth to a new humanity. The end of the world turns out not to be a full stop, but merely a comma in the endless cycle of the universe. This myth gave the Vikings incredible resilience in the face of any life-altering catastrophe. Even if your home burned down and your family perished, it is merely part of the great cosmic cycle. After the most terrible and longest winter, a new, albeit unfamiliar spring always arrives. Life cannot be completely destroyed. It will always find a way to break through the ashes and stones. This is an incredibly life-affirming idea, hidden within the bleakest scenario of the apocalypse. Ragnarök teaches us that the destruction of the old order is absolutely necessary to create something new. The gods of Asgard were burdened by their old oaths, mistakes, and ancient crimes. Their world had to burn to make way for a generation free from this heavy burden. Modern corporations often fail precisely because they are afraid to dismantle their outdated business models. The Vikings understood this harsh law of renewal 1,000 years before modern economists. So, Ragnarök is not just a scary bedtime story to frighten disobedient children. It is a complex philosophical system explaining the value of courage in the face of absolute hopelessness. It taught people to meet inevitable death with their heads held high and their swords gripped tightly. And it was precisely this knowledge that made the warriors of the North the most dangerous and fearless adversaries in Europe. They already knew their end, and therefore were not at all afraid of its approach. The Viking Age naturally came to an end not because of military defeat at the hands of powerful external enemies. It faded away gradually when the northern kings decided to integrate politically into the European system. Christianity offered them the convenient centralized authority they so desperately needed to create strong states. The ancient gods with hammers and spears gave way to books, regular taxes, and stone cathedrals. But the wild spirit of this harsh religion remained forever in the cultural code of the Scandinavian peoples. The myth of the great Ragnarök remains one of the most powerful finales in the history of world religion. The great gods perish, bright stars fall from the heavens, and the world's oceans swallow up the remnants of the ruined earth. But from the cold ashes, a completely new world is reborn, purer, brighter, and free from the old mistakes. This is a brilliant and beautiful metaphor for the cyclical nature of history and the endless renewal of our vast and complex universe. Even in the darkest of times, the Northern Vikings always saw a bright spark of a completely new beginning. Ahead of us lies a vast array of forgotten technologies, ancient strategies, and great historical mysteries. We will examine in detail how people of the past successfully solved problems that the modern world cannot handle. Be sure to stay with us, because real history is always more interesting than any fictional Hollywood script. Remember that our distant past always shapes our future, even if we don't want to admit it. Until our next exciting encounters at the crossroads of time, where the ancient shadows of our great ancestors come to life.